There are movies that entertain you, and then there are movies that quietly burrow into your bones and stay there for the rest of your life. The Karate Kid is the second kind. Released in the summer of 1984, it arrived with almost no fanfare, no major stars, and a budget so modest that the crew was solving problems with duct tape and creativity on a daily basis. Nobody at the studio expected it to last past opening weekend. The cast didn't expect it. The crew didn't expect it. Even the director, in his more honest moments, might have admitted that what he was making felt fragile, uncertain, like something that could collapse under the weight of its own ambitions at any moment. But it didn't collapse. It soared. And the reason it soared had almost nothing to do with what was planned and almost everything to do with what wasn't. Because behind the film that millions of people have memorized line by line, there is another story entirely. A story of accidents that became masterstrokes, of doubts that gave way to triumphs, and of decisions that looked reckless at the time and turned out to be the wisest choices anyone could have made. That is the story we are telling today. It begins, as all great stories do, with something personal. Before there was a screenplay, before there was a director or a studio deal, there was a teenager getting beaten up at school. Screenwriter Robert Mark Kamen didn't construct the emotional backbone of this film in a writer's room, surrounded by executives throwing out buzzwords about target demographics. He pulled it directly from his own life, from the specific, humiliating, visceral experience of being bullied as a kid and the way that experience had driven him to seek out karate training afterward. That foundation changed everything about what the script became. When pain is real, it writes differently. The characters stop performing emotions and start inhabiting them. The situation stopped feeling constructed and start feeling inevitable. Producer Jerry Weintraub recognized this immediately. He saw that the personal angle wasn't just a selling point. It was the entire engine of the project, and he fought to protect it at every stage of development. He pushed Kamen to expand the story beyond a simple revenge fantasy and shape it into something broader, something that spoke to anyone who had ever felt powerless and found a way through. That instinct, protecting the sincerity of the source material above all else, became the guiding philosophy of the entire production, and you can feel it in every frame. The search for the right actor to play Daniel LaRusso was never about finding a future action star. Director John G. Avildsen had an extremely specific vision, one that ran completely counter to the instincts of most Hollywood productions looking to anchor a crowd-pleasing sports film. He didn't want strength. He didn't want confidence. He didn't want someone who looked like they could handle themselves in a fight. He wanted someone the audience would genuinely worry about. Someone who triggered that protective instinct you feel when you watch a person who is clearly outmatched and clearly trying anyway. Ralph Macchio was that person. He was young-looking, slight, and carried a natural vulnerability that no acting class could manufacture. The moment he appeared on screen, you believed he was in real danger, and that belief was the entire foundation on which the film's emotional journey rested. If Daniel had looked even remotely capable of defending himself, the training montages would have meant nothing. The tournament would have felt like a formality. The audience needed to see a kid who genuinely needed saving, and Macchio delivered that without ever seeming to try. His awkwardness wasn't a limitation they worked around. It was the secret weapon they built the whole film around. While they were figuring out who would play the hero, almost everyone connected to production was quietly trying to figure out why they were stuck with such an embarrassing title. The Karate Kid. Cast members cringed at it. Crew members rolled their eyes. There were genuine conversations about whether the name was too cheap, too cartoonish, too reminiscent of the kind of low-budget Saturday morning programming that nobody took seriously. Some worried it sounded too much like boxing movie titles and would confuse audiences before they even bought a ticket. Others felt would drive away older viewers entirely, limiting the film to a narrow demographic it couldn't survive on alone. Throughout production, the assumption among many was that someone would eventually come up with something better, something with weight and dignity, and the current title would be quietly retired. But no alternative ever emerged that everyone agreed on, and the deadline pressure of an actual production doesn't leave a lot of room for extended debates about branding. So the name stayed, not because anyone loved it, because nothing better came along in time. The irony, of course, is almost too large to fully absorb. The title that everyone wanted to replace became one of the most instantly recognizable, culturally embedded titles in the history of popular cinema. Its simplicity, which everyone had criticized as a weakness, turned out to be its greatest strength. You heard it, and you immediately knew exactly what you were getting. No ambiguity, no pretension, just a clear, direct promise of the film then delivered on in ways nobody anticipated. The kids cast as the Cobra Kai bullies looked apart so convincingly that most viewers never suspected how different their real lives were from their on-screen personas. Several members of that group were children of Hollywood figures, kids who had grown up on film sets and understood the rhythms of production in ways that gave them a natural fluency in front of cameras that most young performers at their level simply didn't have. Chad McQueen, son of the legendary Steve McQueen, was among them, carrying one of the most famous last names in cinema history onto a set where it was quietly acknowledged and then largely set aside. Their familiarity with the craft translated into something invaluable on screen. They moved together with a cohesion that made them feel genuinely threatening, without tipping over into exaggeration. They understood timing and blocking instinctively, which saved the crew significant hours that a less experienced group would have cost them. Nobody watching the film has any reason to suspect they're watching industry legacy kids play rough street-level antagonists, and that gap between reality and performance is one of the film's most fascinating hidden layers. The role of Ollie, Daniel's love interest, came close to going to someone completely different. Studio logic pushed for a name with built-in recognition, an actress who would give the film a commercial hook beyond its unknown male lead. But Avildsen had a different sense of what the romance needed to work. He wasn't looking for star power. He was looking for something that couldn't be calculated or rehearsed, the kind of natural warmth that either a person has or they don't. Elizabeth Shue, with almost no film experience at the time, walked into her audition and simply had it. There was an effortlessness to how she inhabited the character, a spontaneity in the way she responded to scenes that made every moment with Macchio feel genuinely unforced. The chemistry between them wasn't manufactured through clever writing or strategic framing. It emerged from two actors who happened to feel completely real together. The studio eventually trusted the director's instinct over commercial logic, and the gamble paid off completely. The romance became one of the film's emotional anchors precisely because it never felt like a romance written by a committee. It felt like two actual people figuring something out together. Then there is a decision that arguably changed the entire identity of the film, a decision that looked on paper like a mistake and turned out to be an act of genius. The role of Mr. Miyagi, the character around whom everything else ultimately orbits, was originally intended for a serious dramatic actor, someone with immediate gravitas and a list of credits that would signal to audiences that this was a role worth taking seriously. Comedic performers were not part of the conversation. Pat Morita, best known at the time for playing the affable Arnold on Happy Days, was precisely the kind of casting that makes studio executives nervous. His reputation was built on lighthearted television work, and the concern was straightforward. Audiences would see him and think of sitcom punchlines rather than quiet wisdom. But Morita got a chance to audition, and what happened in that room was the kind of thing that doesn't have a clean explanation. He delivered a reading so emotionally complex, so layered with unspoken feeling, that it completely dismantled the vision the filmmakers had been working toward and replaced it with something more interesting. The room went quiet. Then the conversation shifted. The mentor figure went from being a conventionally wise authority figure to something far more human, a man carrying his own grief beneath the calm exterior, someone whose teaching came not from mastery alone, but from loss. That single audition didn't just fill a role. It redefined what the film was about. And then Morita did something that actors rarely get credit for in the way they deserve. He didn't stop at what the script gave him. He brought himself into the character in ways that no writer could have anticipated from the outside, drawing from his own experiences, his own pain, his own understanding of what it means to carry things quietly while still showing up for someone who needs you. He added texture to Miyagi that transformed the character from a function of the plot into a fully realized human being. The improvisations and personal contributions he brought to the role changed the emotional architecture of the movie. What had started as a coming-of-age sports story gradually revealed itself to be something deeper, a relationship drama between a lost kid and a man with his own unspoken wounds. Every scene between them gained weight, because Morita was investing something real in each one. The character endures because he was built from genuine human experience, and audiences can feel that truth even when they can't name it. There was also a quiet, strategic move made before the film even reached theaters that shaped how audiences would experience Morita's performance before he spoke a single line. Producer Jerry Weintraub insisted that the actor be credited under his full birth name, Noriyuki, followed by his familiar stage name, creating a credit that read Noriyuki Pat Morita. The reasoning was deliberate and precise. Weintraub understood that walking into the theater expecting Arnold from Happy Days meant the audience would never fully receive what Morita was offering dramatically. By leading with a formal Japanese name, the credit functioned as a quiet reintroduction, a subtle signal to audiences that what they were about to see was something different from what they might expect. Morita himself acknowledged the move for what it was, a commercial reframing of his identity for a new kind of role. It worked exactly as intended. Viewers came to character without the weight of prior associations, and were therefore able to absorb the full depth of what Morita had built. A small typographic decision influenced the emotional experience of millions of people without any of them ever realizing it was happening. The production itself was working with resources that by Hollywood standards were remarkably thin. The budget forced constant improvisation and creative problem-solving at every level of the crew. Elaborate studio sets were largely out of question, so the filmmakers turned instead to real locations across Southern California, shooting in actual apartments on real streets and in genuine local spaces that gave every scene a texture that money has a difficult time buying. That constraint, which could easily have been a source of frustration and compromise, ended up being one of the film's defining qualities. The world felt lived in because it genuinely was. There was no glossy veneer separating the audience from the characters. The modest scale made Daniel's situation feel immediately recognizable, like something that could happen in your own neighborhood, your own school, your own parking lot. Viewers weren't watching a polished fantasy. They were watching something that felt real, and that feeling of reality was the invisible hand guiding their emotional investment throughout every scene. Nobody at the studio was prepared for what happened once the film opened. The projections had been modest. The marketing campaign had been modest. And the general expectation was that the movie would have a quiet theatrical run before making its way quickly to home video. There were no stars to guarantee opening weekend numbers, and no franchise awareness to bring in built-in audiences. The film essentially had to earn everything it got through the oldest mechanism in entertainment, one person telling another person that they had to see this. Word of mouth spread with an intensity that caught everyone off guard. Audiences came back for second viewings. Families went together. The film climbed the box office charts week after week until it had become one of the biggest hits of the year, a result that nobody who worked on it had genuinely allowed themselves to believe was possible. For the cast and crew, the impact was immediate and disorienting in the best possible way. People who had spent weeks assuming they were working on something small and forgettable suddenly found themselves attached to a phenomenon. The surprise amplified everything. It validated every risky decision, every moment of doubt, every choice that had looked uncertain at the time and turned out to be exactly right. Beneath the training sequences and the tournament drama, the film was quietly doing something that most mainstream entertainment never attempts. It was teaching. One of the most emotionally devastating scenes in the movie reveals that Mr. Miyagi served in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the legendary Japanese-American unit that fought for the United States during World War II while their families were held in internment camps on American soil. For many viewers, particularly younger audiences seeing the film in 1984, this was the first time they had ever encountered this history. The scene didn't announce itself as a history lesson. It emerged naturally from a quiet conversation, from the specific grief of a specific man, in a way that landed with full emotional force, precisely because it wasn't framed as information delivery. The filmmakers trusted their audience to feel the weight of what was being said without having the significance spelled out for them, and that trust was repaid in full. The moment stayed with people long after everything else had faded. It is in many ways the most quietly radical thing the film does, embedding real history into the emotional fabric of a personal story and letting it work on audiences without their defenses up. The climactic crane kick, the image that became synonymous with the entire film, very nearly didn't make it to the screen in any form worth keeping. Early attempts during filming looked either too awkward to take seriously or too physically risky to repeat without injury, and the frustration on set was real and growing. There were genuine discussions about whether to abandon the idea entirely and replace it with a more conventional finishing move that would have been safer and easier to execute convincingly. The pressure was coming from multiple directions at once. The clock was ticking, and the scenes that had been attempted were not working. But the crew stayed with it, adjusting the choreography incrementally, working through the physical and logistical problems one at a time until they finally captured a version that was both dramatically satisfying and physically believable. What emerged from that persistence became arguably the single most recognizable image in martial arts film history. The struggle behind the moment, the genuine uncertainty about whether it would ever work, makes its final impact even more significant. The kick almost didn't happen. The fact that it did, and that it looks so inevitable when you watch it, is itself a kind of quiet miracle. The All-Valley Karate Tournament was constructed with an unusual degree of attention to how real competitive karate actually operates. The filmmakers consulted with genuine referees and martial arts professionals to design a competition format that would feel authentic to anyone familiar with the sport, using real scoring structures, proper resets between points, and match flows that mirrored what you would actually see at a regional tournament. That commitment to accuracy gave the climax a credibility that most sports films skip entirely in favor of heightened drama. Yet the film also knew exactly when to break its own rules. The crane kick that wins Daniel the championship would almost certainly be ruled an illegal strike in most genuine competitive karate formats. A kick to the face in controlled point sparring draws penalties rather than victories under most real rule sets. The filmmakers knew this. They chose a dramatic finish anyway, and it was unquestionably the right call. Nobody who has ever watched that ending remembers the rule technicalities. Everyone remembers the kick. Knowing when authenticity serves the story and when to set aside is a skill that separates good filmmakers from great ones. The fight choreography throughout the entire film was the work of Pat Johnson, a martial arts expert whose approach prioritized clarity and believability over spectacle. Johnson understood something fundamental about how action sequences serve narrative. Each strike needed to register clearly on screen. Each exchange needed to make sense within the emotional arc of the scene. And the overall level of technical skill needed to feel like something a trained teenager could actually achieve rather than the work of a seasoned stunt professional. That restraint was deliberate, and it was crucial. If Daniel's fighting had looked too polished, the audience would have stopped believing in his vulnerability. Johnson's background in real competitive martial arts gave every sequence an authenticity that separated the film from its contemporaries, and his discipline behind the camera was one of production's most underappreciated contributions to its lasting success. Most audiences have watched the film many times without ever suspecting how much invisible craft went into making those sequences feel as natural as they do. Johnson also appears in the film in front of the camera, which is one of production's most enjoyable hidden layers. The man who designed every punch, block, and kick in the movie stepped in the role of tournament referee for the All-Valley competition, officiating the sequences he had choreographed from behind the camera. His presence in that role wasn't just a convenient casting shortcut. His deep familiarity with actual martial arts competition meant that his reactions, his calls, and his physical presence during the tournament scenes carried genuine authority. He didn't have profound understanding of the rules because he actually possessed it. Most viewers have watched the film dozens of times without ever making a connection between the person who shaped every fight and the person standing at the center of the tournament calling the action. It is one of those details that rewards the kind of dedicated attention that genuine love for a film eventually produces. During the filming of a rehearsal sequence, Ralph Macchio was genuinely struck and left with a visible bruise. Rather than covering the injury with makeup or reorganizing the schedule to shoot around it, the production simply incorporated the bruise into the scene and kept moving. The decision reflected something true about the film's entire approach. A teenager being beaten up by bullies with a real bruise on his face was not a problem to be solved. It was a detail that made everything feel more honest. The accident became an asset, adding a layer of physical reality that no special effects work could have replicated with the same naturalness. Viewers watching that scene have no way of knowing which marks were applied by the makeup department and which one arrived unplanned. The genuine injury disappears into performance so seamlessly that it enhances the moment without ever announcing itself. which is precisely the kind of invisible contribution that defines the film's relationship with authenticity throughout its entire runtime. The original cut of the film contained additional confrontation scenes between Daniel and Johnny that pushed the rivalry into darker, harsher territory. These sequences extended the tension between the characters in ways that felt satisfying in isolation, but ultimately shifted the tone of the movie away from where it needed to go. Removing them was a significant editorial decision that tightened the pacing and, more importantly, cleared space for the emotional beats that the film actually needed audiences to feel. Without the extra aggression cluttering the middle of the story, the focus could remain where it belonged, on Daniel's growth and on the relationship between the student and the man who chose to guide him. Some of that deleted footage eventually found its way into special edition releases, and watching it reveals a noticeably darker version of the rivalry that would have meaningfully changed how audiences perceive both characters. It is a fascinating glimpse into an alternate film that existed before careful editing shaped it into the one people carry with them today. The version of the story audiences know also originally kept going well past the tournament victory. Early cuts followed Daniel and the other characters into additional scenes that extended beyond the climactic moment, and those scenes cost the film something essential. They diluted the emotional peak, spreading the energy out past the point where it needed to land and stay. Test audiences felt it without necessarily being able to articulate what was wrong, and the filmmakers recognized the problem and solved it with a bold simplicity. They cut everything after the tournament finale and ended the film at the precise moment of maximum emotional resonance. That single editorial decision transformed the climax from just another scene into the defining image of the entire story, one that audiences would replay in their heads for years. Much of the removed material was later woven into the sequel, giving the continuation a foundation that had already been filmed and tested. It is a rare example of deleted material finding genuine new life, and a reminder that knowing when to stop is one of the most important skills in storytelling. Pat Morita's portrayal of Mr. Miyagi earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, and that nomination changed everything about how the film was perceived by the industry and by critics who had initially filed away as lightweight youth entertainment. Suddenly, the movie was being discussed alongside serious dramatic work. The nomination validated every unconventional decision that had been made during production, from the casting choice that nobody initially believed into the emotional depth that had been woven into a story many expected to coast on tournament drama and training montages. For Morita personally, it represented the culmination of years of work trying to step outside the comedic identity that television had built for him. He didn't take home the award that night, but the nomination permanently elevated both his legacy and the film's place in American cinema. Miyagi became not just a memorable character, but an iconic figure, representing something that audiences across generations have continued to reach for: wisdom delivered without performance, strength expressed through patience, and care shown through action rather than decoration. One of the film's most beloved locations was built from essentially nothing. Miyagi's workshop, the setting for so many of the film's quietest and most meaningful scenes, was constructed inside a parking area by a production team that had no money for elaborate sets, but had considerable ingenuity and an understanding of what the space needed to feel like emotionally. Every prop was selected to communicate a life of patient craftsmanship. Every camera angle was chosen to hide the true surroundings and maintain the illusion of a space that had been inhabited and shaped over decades. The limited physical dimensions actually served the location by forcing intimate compositions that made the workshop feel warm and personal rather than artificial. It became one of the most iconic spaces in the entire film, a place audiences associate with patience and growth and the specific quality of attention that a good teacher brings to a student who needs it. The fact that it was built from almost nothing in a parking lot is the most perfect possible metaphor for everything the film itself managed to accomplish. The release of the film triggered a cultural shift that extended far beyond anything a box office number can capture. Martial arts dojos across the country saw dramatic spikes in enrollment almost immediately. Kids who had watched Daniel's journey wanted to begin their own. Parents who had never considered karate classes for their children were suddenly signing up and driving across town for introductory lessons. The crane kick became a schoolyard ritual performed by an entire generation in backyards and playgrounds everywhere. Lines in the film entered everyday conversation and stayed there. But the deeper shift was philosophical. Before this film, martial arts movies were largely built around physical dominance and combat spectacle. This one placed inner discipline and personal growth at the center of the story and treated the fighting as almost secondary. That reframing rippled through decades of storytelling that followed, influencing filmmakers, television writers, game designers, and storytellers across every medium who borrowed its central insight that the most important battles are the ones fought inside yourself, and that the best teachers are the ones who already know what it costs to lose. What the Karate Kid proved in the end was something that Hollywood has always suspected but rarely has the courage to bet on. Sincerity is enough. You don't need spectacle. You don't need stars. You don't need a title everyone agrees on, or a set that wasn't built in a parking lot, or a mentor played by someone whose last job was a sitcom. What you need is a story that came from somewhere real, told by people who believe in it more than the evidence suggested they should, and performed by actors who brought something of themselves into every scene. The film that nobody expected to last past opening weekend has now lasted for decades, and will keep lasting, because the things it is about, feeling lost, finding guidance, earning something through genuine effort, being seen by someone who understands your particular kind of pain, are not things that go out of date. They are simply human. And that is the one ingredient no budget can buy and no studio executive can manufacture. The heart of this story was real from the very first draft, and every secret hidden within it only confirms what audiences have always felt without being able to explain. This film was never an accident. It was the inevitable result of people choosing honesty over everything else, every single time the choice presented itself.